Undoubtedly, artificial intelligence can interact both with consciousness and with non-conscious awareness. Yes, we should be concerned because there are enormous risks here. Anytime a species enters into a deep symbiosis with another species, there are always risks. When I published my book, How We Became Posthuman, which is now quarter of a century old, the title was conceived in an ironic mode, as if we had already become posthuman. The issue here is, if we are in an era of eroding the human aura, if the originality of the human person is being challenged by all of these new technologies, how can that serve a liberatory purpose, not merely be the loss of nostalgic past? So I think that real key here is to understand that the human is a social and cultural construction, and that we are jointly, collectively, as a global society, in the process of fashioning what the human means in the 21st century.
Welcome to Ceci, the podcast where you see what others see.
Hi there. Good morning. So today, what are we talking about? Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Ceci here. Is anyone there? Hi, my name is Ceci. I'm based in Berlin, and I want to welcome you to Ceci, the podcast where you see what others see. This season is all about the mind. And today we're going to ask a deceptively simple question. What if thinking isn't uniquely human? What if cognition stretches all the way from bacteria to artificial intelligence? And what happens when all these minds, biological and artificial, interact? We'll talk about robots, about imagination and creativity, and what becomes of the Enlightenment idea of free will when cognition turns out to be so much larger than we thought. A conversation about what it means to be human at a time when the boundary between us and our technologies is quietly disappearing, and the hope that we might build a future worth living in. And for that, guess with whom we'll be talking.
Our guest today is Katherine Hayles, one of the world's leading scholars at the intersection of literature, science, and technology in the 20th and 21st centuries. She's Distinguished Research Professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, and James B. Duke Professor Emerita at Duke University. Throughout her pioneering career, she's transformed our understanding of the digital age by exploring the co-evolution of humans and intelligent systems, and by pioneering critical thought on posthumanism, cognitive science, and the materiality of media. She's published over 100 peer-reviewed articles and is the author of 12 influential books, including Post-Print, Books and Becoming Computational, Unthought, The Power of the Cognitive Non-Conscious, How We Became Posthuman, Virtual Bodies in Literature, Cybernetics and Informatics, a landmark in literary and media theory, honoured with the Renee Wellick Prize, and Writing Machines, for which she received the Suzanne Langer Award. Her latest book, Bacteria to AI, Human Futures with Our Nonhuman Symbionts, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2023, explores how humans are fundamentally intertwined with non-human intelligences, from microbial ecosystems to artificial agents, offering a bold framework for understanding our shared future. a recipient of many fellowships and awards, including 2 National Endowment for the Humanities fellowships, a fellowship from the Guggenheim Foundation, a Rockefeller Residential Fellowship at Bellagio, and 2 University of California Presidential Research Fellowships. Hayles is also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Hayles' groundbreaking contributions on consciousness, the self, and the interaction between biology and technology, as well as her exploration of memory and the ability to reflect, continue to challenge our understanding of how emerging technologies are reshaping human thought, identity, and culture.
Professor Katherine Hayles, what an honor. Thank you for being with us today. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
At birth, many creatures can survive on their own, while human babies are among the most helpless. Yet, it is precisely our minds that have transformed us into not just survivors, but thrivers. These 2 ideas, the frailty of our beginnings and the power of our intellect, have long reinforced the belief in human superiority, an assumption that no longer stands unshaken. Up next, we will hear Dr. Elsa Richardson, specialized in the intersection of medical and cultural history, question neuroscientist John Cryan on his thoughts on human intelligence. John Cryan is Vice President for Research and Innovation at University College Cork, UCC, and Professor in the Department of Anatomy and Neuroscience and Principal Investigator at APC Microbiome Ireland Institute.
How has your research into the gut-brain axis shifted your understanding of intelligence? As a neuroscientist, I would assume that intelligence for you might be something primarily understood in relation to the workings of the brain, firing neurons, neural pathways, and so on. But has your research into the gut and its microbiome changed how you view intelligence?
Well, that's a great question. And we think of intelligence in terms of its cognitive function in general. And over the past 2 decades, we've had a complete new way of looking at how we can influence aspects of fundamental neurobiological aspects of cognitive function by the gut microbiome. And in terms of this being a shift, I think so, because in neuroscience and intelligence research in particular, people are very focused on what happens from the neck up. But now reframing the question around how microbes in the lumina of the gut can actually send signals to your brain and affect higher cognitive function across the lifespan is beginning to challenge us as to really what is the brain doing and how it's working in its most fundamental part.
Professor Hayles, your work challenges the idea of human superiority. By looking at different kinds of cognition and how they connect, you give us fresh ways to think about intelligence, survival, and interconnectedness. And to start, I'd love to ask, when you talk about human cognition, how do you understand it, and what processes or elements are included in this concept?
Well, thank you for that question. I noticed that our previous speaker was talking about intelligence. There are about 27 definitions of intelligence at least, so I try to avoid that term myself, and I prefer to use the term cognition. So I do have a definition of cognition. I define cognition as a process of interpreting information in contexts that connected with meaning. And by this definition, all living organisms have cognitive capabilities. All living organisms receive information from their environment. They interpret it through their species-specific capabilities, and they act on that interpretation. So my book, Bacteria to AI, is really trying to recontextualize human cognition in relation to other forms of cognition, both other biological organisms and also artificial intelligence.
And Professor Hayles, in your book on thought, you make the argument that for humans, consciousness is only a small part of cognition, but it needs the non-conscious cognition filter in order to operate. What parts do you identify when you talk about cognition inside this framework?
Yes, in my book Unthought, I did argue that most of human behavior is not conscious. It is done simply through habit and through a bodily understanding of what's needed. We don't consciously think about how to sit down in a chair or how to open a door. So the function of non-conscious cognition is really to filter the information received from the environment, and it operates much faster than consciousness and then forwards activation signals to consciousness, which can either be picked up and strengthened by consciousness or not, in which case they quickly die away. So non-conscious cognition comes online first and is much broader, faster, and closer to what's actually happening than is consciousness.
And I love also the clear discernment that you do from non-conscious systems or activity to the unconscious, which is different, right?
Yes, so I do distinguish between the non-conscious and the unconscious. So as we know, the unconscious has been theorized by Freud, Lacan, and so forth. And it can be understood in my terms as suppression from conscious awareness. In fact, that's how Freud interpreted it. So the unconscious is a form of consciousness which has been suppressed, but it operates by the same logic and rules as consciousness, whereas the non-conscious operates by different rules, has a different time scale, and so forth.
In consciousness, we have cognition, non-consciousness, and unconscious.
That's correct. Yes, and I group the unconscious together with consciousness as forms of awareness that are governed by the same neurological processes, whereas non-conscious cognition operates on a different neuronal basis.
Yeah, I think this argument to uncouple cognition from consciousness is a brilliant one because it certainly gives a very good and clear base to develop other kinds of discernments.
That is really the point of the Unthought book, to argue that consciousness is not the whole of cognition. It's only a small part of cognition, even in humans. And in non-human organisms, the fact that they are not conscious, for example, trees are not conscious, fungi are not conscious, bacteria are not conscious, does not mean that they do not have cognitive capabilities. In fact, they do. So the uncoupling of consciousness with cognition is a crucial move.
And you're talking now about fungi. And, to prepare for this season, I dove into books about trees, plants, and fungi, discovering how mycelium networks link plants and animals, and how they communicate, feed, and form relationships. And one of the books that I really liked was one of Susan Simard's called Mother Trees, where she shows how forests are interconnected communities, with mother trees acting as hubs, nurturing and communicating through fungal networks. And learning about these interdependent systems, I thought that really challenges our narrow view of human superiority, because when I was reading this book, I thought about all the underlying networks. And so, I thought about how we overlook this both living world around us and also within our own bodies, as Professor Cryan was telling us in the first excerpt we heard. And you created a framework called the Integrated Cognitive Framework. And that is something I found not only important, but basic from your whole work. Can you talk about this cognitive framework and how it decentralizes human cognition?
Yeah, that's exactly right, that the integrated cognitive framework is intended to contextualize human cognition in relation to other forms of cognition. And an important element here, which hasn't been mentioned yet, is the idea of the umwelt, term from 19th century biologist Jakob von Uexküll. And Uexküll's idea was simple and brilliant, and that is that each species constructs its own world dependent on its neurological and physical capacities. So that has a number of interesting implications, one of which is that humans do not sense reality any more than all the other species do. We sense reality as interpreted through human sensibilities. So we're always within the human umwelt, a word that means roughly world horizon or world surround. And there's no way that we can escape it because we always see with human eyes, we think with human brains. Now, we have enlarged our umwelt through technologies like microscopes, telescopes, and so forth. But in the last analysis, all of that is always filtered through a human brain. And we know from astrophysicists that the portion of reality that we sense is only a small part of the universe. They tell us that dark energy, about which we know almost nothing, and dark matter, about which we know very little, constitutes the majority of the universe. So we're in our bubble, so to speak, our human bubble. We can push the perimeters out, which of course we have done, but we'll never escape it. So that's one of the implications of the umwelt idea, and it's central to the idea of an integrated cognitive framework, because in order for two species to communicate, they have to have overlapping umwelten. So we communicate with dogs, for example, because we know that they see the squirrel that we also see, and so we can communicate through words or signals or body language about it. If there's no overlap between the umwelten, then communication is not possible, although we have found a lot of artificial ways to begin to create those overlaps, for example, with the fungal networks you were mentioning.
So in this framework, Professor Hayles, then we have the umwelt, so to say, the different cognitive capabilities of the different agents. And then we have a way to build up a relationship, right, between these when they overlap?
Yes, that's right. So once we realize that we are not ever going to see reality as such, whatever that may mean, and we realize that we always interpret it through the human umwelt, then we have ways to compare our umwelt with the umwelten of other species. And this is important for interspecies understanding communication. It's become extremely important now that we have synthetic intelligences, which have a very different umwelt than the human umwelt. And it's crucial for us to understand the ways in which our umwelt differs from that of an AI, for example, ChatGPT.
I see. And I think there's another concept in these relationships, which is symbiosis, which I remember I read it also includes the parasite-host relationship, right?
Yes. So this idea really builds upon the work of Lynn Margulis, biologist, very distinguished biologist, who really revolutionized the evolutionary picture of how dynamics work by arguing that the main driver of evolution is not natural selection, as Darwin suggested, but rather symbiosis. And she did some astonishing pioneering work in being able to prove that the emergence of eukaryotic cells, that is, cells that can use oxygen, in fact occurred through an act of endosymbiosis. When one prokaryotic species invaded another, didn't die completely, but rather became the mitochondria, the energy-producing part of a cell. That was confirmed when it was discovered that the DNA of the mitochondria are different than the DNA of the nucleus. So there are two different species now living together as a single organism, and the word that Margulis uses to describe that is endosymbiosis. I built on that work and extended it to talk about the human relationship with computational media. And I argue that we are in a deep symbiotic relationship with computational media, which is about to be extended even further through the invention of AI.
Talking about symbiosis, I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the relationship between cognitive and material processes and the distribution of agency and cognition.
So all cognition is built on physical and chemical processes. That's the foundation from which all higher capabilities emerge. But I distinguish between cognitive systems, which have the ability to perform interpretations and make selections or choices, and purely physical chemical processes. So I call cognitive agents actors and physical chemical processes agents. So I'm distinguishing between actors and agents. So an example of process that has agency would be a tornado. But a tornado is incapable of performing interpretations or making selections. It doesn't choose where it goes. It's just the resultant of all the physical forces acting upon it. Whereas all living organisms have the capability to make selections and perform interpretations. So all living organisms are actors. Physical, chemical, or material processes in themselves are agents, and now we have AI or computational media, which began by being purely deterministic, but with the invention of networks, of sensory apparatus, they've become more and more like actors rather than agents.
Very clearly explained. Speaking about the nature of symbiotic relationships between the brain and the microbiome, if you allow me, I'd like to play a clip in which Professor Cryan again discusses how signaling, exchanges, and communications in the brain axis have always been coevolutionary. Let's listen how he specifically addresses the effect, perhaps agency, of microbes in human social behavior.
Whether it's in C. elegans, the worm, in Drosophila, the fruit fly, in zebrafish, they all have mechanisms that the microbiome can actually signal and change behavior. And that to me is quite startling, helping us to understand that this anatomical link is evolutionary wired. And it's worth remembering that the microbes were there first. And so there never has been a time where our anatomy has existed without these microbial signals. So we have evolved to be able to respond to such signals and basically co-evolved to work in tandem with them. There's something about the social brain in particular that makes it sensitive to signals from the microbiome. And then we've surveyed this across the entire animal kingdom. So whether it's a bumblebee in a hive or a baboon in the wild in Africa, when you start looking at when you change social hierarchies and social dynamics, you start to change the composition of the microbiome, and vice versa. If you start to change the microbiome, the one behavior that starts to come, no matter what type of animal you're looking at across the animal kingdom, it seems to be consistently social behavior in particular.
Professor Hayles, what influence does cognition has in evolutionary trajectories? And could you give us an example?
So yes, there is a sense, as your excerpt explained, in which we're all collectivities, that we're all carrying our microbiomes with us. They do have an influence on behavior, has been demonstrated empirically in various ways. So it really does raise the question, who is deciding here? Is it the individual as it's conceptualized in the Western tradition? Is it some community of beings of which we're the hosts? And I guess the answer to that is yes, it's both. I think that it would be misleading to cast aside the idea of human decision-making altogether, that it may have collective influence, but to my mind at least, it's absolutely clear that humans do make decisions. They have neurology and the processes to be able to do that. However, they are influenced by the collectivity of which we're a part. So I expanded this idea to talk about cognitive assemblages, which I define as collectivities of humans, non-humans, and synthetic intelligences, all performing interpretations and making selections. So most of the world's work today in developed societies is done through cognitive assemblages. And you can, in fact, think of a single person as a cognitive assemblage because of the cognitive contributions of the microbiome. But even more so, if you have a developed society in which computational media are controlling, manipulating, storing, and processing the flows of information, that becomes a crucial part of the very existence of the society. We couldn't exist for, more than a few months without the computational infrastructure that we built up. It's absolutely crucial to all of our social dynamics, from our food distribution networks to our financial system and so forth. So they have become our deeply embedded symbionts, and it'll be very interesting to see where this goes now that we have invented a cognitive technology. So all the technologies that we had invented prior to this had limited or no cognitive abilities, but now we've invented very powerful cognitive actors. So to what extent that's going to change human society and human dynamics, I think, remains an open question.
Professor, your studies make a very powerful observation in which you see three domains of emergence, which are micro, evo, and techno. Micro referring to quantum phenomena, evo to biological evolution, and techno to technological and cognitive development. And all of them, of course, coming together, embracing the term micro-evo-techno. Could you please explain this concept that you develop in your book, Bacteria to AI, and give us some examples on how these three domains interact?
Well, thank you. Yes, so I developed these three categories: micro, which is both the microscopic realm and the quantum realm, and the second is evo, the evolutionary realm, and then techno, the technological realm. And all of these demonstrate what I call first-order emergence. So Karen Barad, for example, makes the argument that quantum phenomena at the quantum level are emergent. They come into existence with their intra-actions with the experimental setup. So they are emergent in the sense that they're dependent on the interaction. So anything we know about the quantum realm through experiments and so forth are emergent phenomena, at least in Barad's view. So in the evo realm, it's clear that evolutionary dynamics are emergent from the get-go. They're entirely dependent on the environment, the interaction between species and the environment. So we can see that the emergence of the hominid line, for example, is a first-order emergence dictated by evolutionary dynamics. Now we get to the techno realm, and now we get a strong feedback loop between the hominid line, specifically Homo sapiens, and the technology that our species has invented. So from the very beginning of the species, something like the invention and fabrication of tools encouraged bipedalism, facilitated the fabrication and transport of tools, further accelerated the development of bipedalism. So from the very beginning, our species has been involved in this strong feedback loop with the technologies, even more so now at present that we've invented these powerful cognitive technologies. So now we have these three separate realms, micro, evo, and techno, but now they're all interacting with each other. to create what I call second-order emergence. So, for example, the micro realm is interacting with the techno realm and with the non-human to create something like gene editing, an extremely powerful technology. So that's a second-order emergence. And as we go from first-order emergence to second-order emergence, the dynamics accelerate and become more powerful. So we're now on a very steep exponential upward climb, and we do not know where this is headed, and it is fraught with dangers as well as enormous benefits.
CRISPR-9 would be in the second order of emergence, right?
Yes, CRISPR technologies, which are crucial to gene editing, are, in my terms, a second-order emergence, because it's the interaction of what bacteria do when they encounter a virus with the technologies that allow the researchers that got the Nobel Prize for their work to develop a gene splicing all-purpose agent.
And before we continue, Professor Hayles, if you allow me, for those listening that may not be familiar with CRISPR, I'd like to play the following excerpt for some context.
Nobel Prize laureates Emmanuel Charpentier and Jennifer A. Doudna discovered a key gene technology tool, the CRISPR-Cas9 genetic scissors. These let researchers change the DNA of animals, plants, and microorganisms very precisely. This technology is changing the life sciences. It is helping to develop new cancer therapies and could help to cure inherited diseases. Humans have DNA and RNA. DNA is our genetic material. It is found in the chromosomes in cell nuclei and contains the code for making all the body's proteins. RNA is created specifically for protein synthesis and has functions such as coding, decoding, regulating, and expressing genes. It is found in both the nucleus and cytoplasm and makes up about 5% of a human cell, while DNA makes up about 1%. Many of these RNA elements exist in nature, but can also be created. This makes RNA an important part of the rapidly developing field of synthetic biology. It can be used to silence target gene expressions via RNA interference. Finally, expressions of shRNA in cells are typically accomplished by delivery of plasmids or trough viral or bacterial vectors.
And talking now about technology and about how humans are individual and collective at the same time, and also being cognitive beings that can interpret their world and act upon it, and having agency. I think this brings us closer to the concept of individuality and free will, which of course goes hand in hand with the development of humanism and individualism and the idea of self-ownership. As the French Revolution broke and became the major factor of European politics, philosophers like Descartes, Locke, Hume, and William James, Kant, and Fichte put the self at the center of the stage. The idea of the ultimate freedom was imagination, as rational thinking, and the idea of the self. It was in that moment in history that the individual experience became the guiding light of thought, at least formally. Richard Borg is professor of the history of political thought at the University of Cambridge, co-director of the Cambridge Center for Political Thought, and a fellow of King's College. Let's listen to him on Kant's approach to identity and self-consciousness and his perspective on the evolution of personal identity and self-expression from the 18th century to the present.
Normativity, or law-giving, or values, you might say, or values and standards, both in nature and in society, they derived, he thought, from the self, not from outside, not from God, not from nature, but from the self. Second of all, that the self both generated and imposed on itself its own values or norms. And third of all, that these included moral norms. I mean, I'd say that's the Kantian revolution, basically, in a nutshell. Now, Kant's successors, or post-Kantians, all described this as a revolution in how we conceived of the world in terms of a transformation of how we saw the role of the self as self-governing or self-grounding and therefore free and law-giving. Kant's self was a self-grounding or free self, and this was seen as a sort of transformation in how humans were viewed and how their values and the origins of the values were viewed. That was the Kantian revolution. I think our sense of self and identity is a product of the late 18th and early 19th century. The idea of, as it were, conscientious self-assertion against custom and against establishments really derives from then. That's, of course, not to say that there have been no changes. I mean, I think the advent of Freud changed how we think about subjectivity. And so very much did the culture of self-expression in the 1960s, the self as entitled to complete self-expression, as it were. But I would say that the roots of these notions are nonetheless do lie within German idealism. So I think there is a beginning point and then sort of changed attitude, certainly around race, gender and sexuality in the 1960s. But as I said, the very idea of the self as entitled to self-expression, I think that's a German idea from the early 19th century. So, this is a ramifying and complicated picture. It's still going on. It comes in waves. The extent to which self-expression has become an all-pervasive norm, impacting upon social relations. And altogether, I think the 60s is the tipping point.
In matters of identity, of course, how can we not talk today about technology and its effects on identity? And in your book, How We Became Posthuman, regarded as the Bible of posthumanist studies, you showed how cybernetics and digital technologies reshape the way we think about humans and consciousness. Could you be so kind in orienting us about the three waves or phases of cybernetics you trace in history and how each changed or shifted our cultural and scientific understanding of humans and machines?
Yes, in my book, which is now a quarter of a century old, I did have extensive archival research into the formation of cybernetics. And cybernetics really came about because it joined the ancient idea of a feedback mechanism with the new idea of information. And that provided a way to talk about feedback loops, feed-forward dynamics, so on. And it really revolutionized how people thought about their relationship to machines and also their relationship to the environment. So, for example, Gregory Bateson made the observation, influenced by cybernetics, that an organism that does not receive feedback from the environment is set up for collapse. And of course, we see that now when the U.S. government has chosen to deny climate change. That's a way of cutting off feedback from the environment, and it almost certainly is going to lead to collapse sooner or later. So cybernetics, with its ideas that you could establish a common language between human behavior and machine behavior, the idea of the feedback loop, the idea of information, really transformed multiple fields. And it's somewhat ironic that even as the ideas from cybernetics flowed into all these different fields and really changed the way people thought, cybernetics as an individual discipline virtually disappeared. So it's kind of an irony that it's everywhere and it's nowhere. But nevertheless, it was highly influential. And it was also very influential in changing the ideas from the Enlightenment they mentioned earlier. The idea of free will, of self-ownership, all those ideas that originated with thinkers like Locke and his contemporaries came under scrutiny because of these ideas from cybernetics and the developing technologies of informational media like virtual reality. So what I argued in the book was that the constellation we inherited from the Enlightenment that was called human, and that came along with these ideas of individuality, free will, rationality, all were being systematically challenged by cybernetics as well as other new computational media.
And how do we interpret the relationship between free will and the assemblages you were talking about before?
Free will and the assemblages. Yes, this is a very complex issue, which I address in my new book. On the one hand, if we're always acting within a collective, what happens to free will? The obvious corollary to talking about cognitive assemblages is that cognition is distributed. It's distributed throughout the collectivity, and consequently, decision-making becomes a collective and collaborative project. A good example of that is a drone and a drone operator. Well, the drone operator is human, but the drone has its own sensory network. It has its own sensory capabilities, and a lot of that processing goes on before the drone operator ever sees the output from the drone. So the drone and the drone operator are a cognitive assemblage, and the drone operator has what we might call putative control. He tells the drone what to do, but his decision is based on all of the prior decisions that he's not aware of in the pre-processing that went on in the drone itself. And so the decision is really a collective decision, and his ability to make that decision is a complex one because it depends on inputs that may not be entirely accurate or may be interpreted in a way that he does not understand. And so almost all decisions now in a complex society are of this kind. They include factors which the so-called decision makers do not know and are not aware of, but nevertheless that influence sometimes decisively what their final decision is. So I think we have to be very cautious talking about free will, that realizing that it is now a collective decision with distributed cognitive capabilities.
Professor Hayles, you propose the SIRAL model to detect whether a system ranging from bacteria and plants to humans and AI are cognitive. What makes the difference in this model, I thought, is how it changes the definition of cognition away from traditional markers like language or self-awareness, instead focusing on, I may say, functional capacities. And I have the following question. First of all, for our audience, what is the criteria contained in the SIRAL model?
So SIRAL is an acronym, and it stands for the 5 criteria by which we can distinguish a cognitive system. So the first is sensing, the ability to sense information from the environment. The second is interpretation. So an enormous amount of interpretation goes on even in very non-human organisms like a frog. There was a famous paper, What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain, that showed how much pre-processing goes on in the optical nerves themselves prior to the brain receiving that information. So interpretation is the second criteria. Responding adaptively is the third criteria. And then the fourth criteria is anticipation, being able to anticipate, which confers enormous adaptive advantage and is shown to exist in non-conscious organisms like trees and plants, but even in bacteria. And then the final criteria is learning, the ability to learn based on the 4 previous behaviors. So that's SIRAL: sensing, interpretation, responding adaptively, anticipating, and learning.
And Professor Hayles, I want to ask you, do you have a pet yourself?
I do. I have a dog, a Sheltie.
And how much insight and vice versa do you think he or she has in your world?
Oh, well, the reason that dogs and humans have been companions for thousands of years is because our dogs know exactly what we're thinking. They're really expert at interpreting body language, finest nuances of tones. They will sense when we are anxious even before we're consciously aware of being anxious. And there are many stories about dogs being able to sense when a seizure, epileptic seizure is coming on, for example, or even being able to sense when their owner has an undiagnosed cancer. So with that superb sense of smell that they have and their sensitivity to human language and body gestures, I think there's a lot of intra-communication going on there.
Absolutely. What would it take for robots to interact with their environment in the same way that living creatures do? In other words, how can they become truly embodied and therefore move towards true cognitive presence?
Yeah, this is really an ongoing, rapidly developing field of research. So one area that we might think about here is the new Waymo vehicles, which I see all the time here in Los Angeles. Self-driving vehicles equipped with a variety of sensors that enable them to negotiate all these complex traffic situations. So that's a form of embodied intelligence. They have AI on board. They have an extensive sensory network on board. And then you have things like humanoid robots or even non-humanoid robots taking over a lot of the routine work in factories now. So they're also equipped with sensors, usually not as extensive as human sensors, but nevertheless sensors. And now the new field of research is to connect the powerful AI technologies that we've been developing, which are purely computational, with robotic bodies. That research is still in its very early stages, but it is very promising because it promises a transformation of the umwelt of artificial intelligence. In fact, it would connect now the kind of umwelt that we have as embodied creatures moving in three-dimensional space with the intelligence of a computational device. That's an extremely powerful and also transformative area of research now undergoing.
Professor Hayles, you made me think about an example of a prosthetic arm that was developed for the U.S. Department of Defense by Dean Kamen, which is called the Look arm. These are not just mechanical tools. They read muscle signals and adjust their grip on the fly, let's say, and even give back sense of touch. And over time, the user's brain and the prosthesis adapt to each other, working as one integrated system. I think that's exactly the kind of human-machine embodiment you're talking about, right, Professor?
Yeah, that would be one example of it. That's a very good example where the plasticity of the human brain allows us to accommodate all kinds of prostheses, intelligent and also non-intelligent prostheses. But when the prosthesis itself is intelligent, then a very strong feedback loop develops between the human brain and the brain, if you will, of whatever the prosthetic device is. That's one avenue that symbiosis with computational media could travel. There are also others like implants of various devices and things that we probably can't even imagine now, but maybe on the future horizon. So it's a very open playing field, and I think there will be many of these pathways that are explored and begin to be developed.
And talking about embodied cognition and the way technology is going to enlarge our umwelt, or is enlarging our umwelt. Alexander Whitley, a fellow guest for this season and the artistic director of Alexander Whitley Company, is a British visionary choreographer who unites contemporary dance and digital innovation to create bold, immersive performances. And he has left the following set of questions for you.
Hello, I'm Alexander Whitley. I'm a choreographer, and I have some questions for Katherine Hayles. So the first part of my question is, could artificial intelligence play a role in the development of skills or the heightening of awareness in areas of cognition that tend to function non-consciously, specifically those related to movement and embodied cognition?
Yeah, that's a great question. So undoubtedly, artificial intelligence can interact both with consciousness and with non-conscious awareness. So there are a lot of possibilities there for exploring what artificial intelligence can tell us about our own capabilities, including our embodied capabilities like movement. So, yeah, that's a very exciting area for artistic development. And I've seen some performances of dance enhanced by AI feedback, and they're really amazing. So I think that is definitely not only possible, but being done in a variety of settings.
And the second part of my question is, should we be concerned about subjecting such non-conscious processes to the influence of artificial agents?
Yes, this is the big question of the day. Should we be concerned about the influence of AI on our actions as individuals, on our societies, and so forth? And the answer is undoubtedly yes, we should be concerned, because there are enormous risks here. Anytime a species enters into a deep symbiosis with another species, there are always risks. For example, in our symbiosis with computational media, hacking, malware, cyber warfare, there are all kinds of risks that are introduced when you become dependent or interdependent with another species, whether it's natural or artificial. So the question is, how can we minimize these risks at the same time that we are able to benefit from the advantages? And that's why I believe that a strong international regulatory framework for the development of AI is crucial. And Europe is far ahead in doing that with their AI Act, whereas here in the U.S., our government has chosen to be more or less hands-off, which I think is a mistake. I think we need a strong regulatory framework.
And thirdly, might physically creative and expressive practices such as dance provide a gateway to the integration of diverse forms of cognition and a more equitable relationship between human and non-human beings?
Yes, I can definitely see that, because embodiment is crucial to the way that humans understand the world. And when you have an agent that is embodied in a very different way, for example, AI, there is a kind of clash between our understanding of what embodiment means and what embodiment means to something like a large language model. And its understanding of human embodiment is always secondhand. It has no firsthand information about that. So it results in things like large language models being very poor at spatial navigation, because they have no experience with actually navigating in three-dimensional world, which we acquire an intuitive understanding of very early. So, yeah, there are these overlaps, but also divergences about which we have to be cautious and also acutely aware.
In your book, Bacteria to AI, again, you draw on Annalee Newitt's novel Autonomous, a fictional relationship between Paladin, a gender-fluid AI, and Elias C., a human soldier.
Paladin has no genitals, no sex programming. Yet, in the heat of training, the robot reads Elias's body as if it were trembling with desire. Rising heart rate, unsteady breath, muscles firing in rhythm with each shot. All the physiological signs of arousal translated into the language of combat. Elias lashes back with denial. "I'm not a faggot," he says, when asked by a confused paladin if he thinks military robots need to learn about human sexuality. But the fusion is already there. As the narrative tells us, Elias derived pleasure not only from hitting the target, but also from feeling alive in the moment the target is being hit. In that moment, war itself becomes erotic. By tying desire to gunfire and resolvent in the target being hit, the novel exposes the connection between Elias's sexuality with extreme violence, toxic masculinity, and its association with violent homophobia.
In light of the interconnected nature of cognition and embodiment, how do you envisage interactions between robots and humans influencing our understanding of intimacy, erotic, and emotional bonds?
Yeah, well, one reason I really like Neuwitz's book is because she's one of the few authors I know of who has really tried to imagine what an embodied robot would think and would feel. So her book does this partly through setting up an erotic relationship between the robot's human partner, Elias, and the robot itself named Paladin. And she's also a feminist, so she's working in gender dynamics there as well. So the robot, as far as its partner is concerned, changes her gender throughout the story, which is a really interesting twist on that. So there's a lot to think about here. If we can imagine embodied robots able to think, able to have their own version of emotions, what kind of relationships might develop with humans? And Neuwitz's novel presents a romantic scenario where the robot and the human partner become romantically entangled with one another. So I think that's an interesting visionary exploration of the kind of partnerships that could develop.
Absolutely. And it gives us also a very important point, I think, which is how this narrative suggests that power and violence are inevitably intertwined with our conception of sexuality. And then I wanted to ask you, do you believe that here there's the potential for these narratives to prompt a revaluation of the origins of violence and thereby facilitating the exploration of alternative, more ethical forms of intimacy?
Well, yes, the power and violence are at the core of this novel because the robot Paladin is a military-issue robot designed as a very sophisticated autonomous weapon with really fearsome capabilities. So violence is always on the horizon, and it frequently occupies the center of that narrative. In terms of how that is going to play out, I mean, we already have a whole array of autonomous weapons that have really fearsome capabilities. And the invention of drones and small weaponized drones in particular has really changed the military calculations. In fact, Daniel Suarez, a novelist, contemporary novelist, in one of his novels, makes the claim that they have rendered traditional armies, tanks, airplanes, irrelevant because of their ability to attack all of this large weaponry. They're small, they're agile, they're autonomous, and they swarm. And so in his vision, they're virtually invincible over conventional weaponry, and they will change the whole course of military history as dramatically as the invention of the tank changed it from horse cavalry. So I think that's a really persuasive argument, and we've already seen that in some drone attacks on aircraft, for example. So yeah, I think that the just speaking in military terms, we may be on an entirely new and untested territory here.
We were talking earlier about the Luke's arm, and before these prostheses came to life, mechanical limbs were much stronger than organic ones, but as we said today, thanks to this electrostatic fingertip system, users are able to retain their sense of touch, similar to Luke Skywalker experience in Star Wars. If we remember, he had an arm grafted to his wrists after Darth Vader cut off his hands at Cloud City. Also, if I remember well, the arm was perfectly formed just as Luke's is now. So, all of this came, I thought, from imagination, of course. Professor Richard Martin had a prolific career at Harvard, Princeton, and currently at Stanford, where he has been the Anthony and Isabel Rubicek Professor of Classics for more than 20 years. And he is a leading authority on Greek mythology, renowned for his pioneering work on ancient Greek poetry in the context of performances and society. Let's hear him on his fears about artificial intelligence and imagination.
I think the first fear that people have is that somehow technology driven by AI will just take over and on its own do things like start wars or break down the infrastructure of water and electricity. I worry about that, but I worry even more as a teacher of humanities that AI will take away imagination. It will take away precisely the kind of muses, the space for transcendence that Greek theater and Greek culture cherished so much. Because once you can just say to AI, write me a novel, write me a poem, and it coughs out something that's convincing, but there's no human heart there, it's a new Pandora.
Professor, you were talking earlier about the ability to look back and forth in order to create reasoning. But I think imagination touches a very high stage of cognitive consciousness. And will machines ever be able to imagine? And if machines were to develop the capacity to imagine and consequently establish their own narratives, what implications would this have for the development of humans' own story?
Well, as a literary critic, I was fascinated by AI-produced literature, and I can tell you that it is, in general, far inferior to human-produced literature. But it raises an interesting possibility, which is that we now have a unique opportunity in human history. Up to now, all of our insights into humans, as rich and varied as they've been across the millennia, have always come from humans. But now we have a cognitive agent, a synthetic intelligence with a completely different umwelt than ours, looking at us from the outside, as it were, from outside the human umwelt. So we have a really opportunity here, not only to deepen our understanding of ourselves, but also to understand in richer detail exactly what kind of umwelt these synthetic intelligences have, what kind of awareness that they have. And you speak of imagination. Well, we've already seen multiple instances of that in what we now call hallucinations, AI hallucinations. But another word for AI hallucinations is AI creativity. So sometimes these hallucinations arise because the user is presenting the AI with an impossible demand. And in that case, the AI, programmed to please the user no matter what, just invents things. And they're counterfactual. They have little connection with reality. But another way to look at them is that they're a fantasy, an imaginative fantasy being produced by the AI. So I think we already see multiple instances of AI imagination. Now, having said that, I'll say that there is a kind of transformative insight that I think is beyond the reach of AI as they are presently constituted with their present architecture. And these are the kinds of insights that really change the nature of the game. So things like Einstein's relativity theory, Darwin's theory of evolution, an entirely new way to think about the situation. AIs cannot do that at present because they are trained and knowledgeable about only what humans have already written. That doesn't mean they can't contribute to knowledge. I think they certainly can. But I don't think that we're going to get a new theory of relativity from an AI.
Fascinating. Following your SIRAL model, these models then, as the LLMs, which include GPT 3, 4, and 5, they will qualify then as cognitive systems. Do you think they will be able to reason in the short term, like memorize or have the ability to go back and forth, like in the near future?
Well, this is sort of an ongoing area of research, but recent research has indicated that the way an LLM solves a math problem, for example, is not through logical steps, but through heuristics. So they're experts at what C.S. Peirce called abduction, the ability to make educated best guesses based on a lot of data. I think at present their capabilities are limited by the transformer architecture on which they're built. And there are a lot of experiments now moving to different kinds of architecture that would include things like long-term memory and enhanced reasoning abilities. So I think that's an open question of how far they will be able to develop these capabilities beyond the transformer architecture.
Do you think there will come a time where the lines of difference between human and machine-made literature will blur, that even experts would not be able to tell the difference?
I'm not an expert in this field, but I think it's already there, at least in terms of musical composition. So algorithms have been developed that can write a new Mozart piece so much like Mozart that experts in the field aren't able to distinguish it. So, yeah, they can already do that in the field of music. I think the field of linguistic narrative is more challenging for them. But bear in mind that this is a kind of intelligence which does not have emotion. And emotion is absolutely crucial to human imaginative acts, whether it's music, whether it's a narrative, or whether it's dance. Emotion is what makes it make sense to humans. You know, literary critics talk about the narrative arc. The narrative arc reveals that narrative is a technology to manipulate human emotions. The beginning engages the emotion, the middle complicates them, and the end resolves emotion. So if you have an entity without emotions, they have only a secondhand understanding of why these things make sense, why a musical composition makes sense, why a good novel makes sense, why it's satisfying, why we go through the experience of having our emotions manipulated and ending it with a sense of satisfaction. Yes, that was good. That was the way it should be. Well, that kind of satisfaction makes no sense to an LLM because it doesn't have emotion. So it can recognize it through the patterns it detects, but it does not feel it the way that humans feel it.
And the other way around is how we perceive their hallucinations that you were talking about before.
Yes, exactly. And I think we need far more research into the kind of awareness that LLMs actually have.
What is the relationship of consciousness to culture in terms of what we're talking now?
Okay. Consciousness it's the foam on the top of the glass of beer. So culture is built on all of these non-conscious behaviors. And then we have consciousness, which interprets what happens and is aware of what's happening and aware of itself. Often consciousness lies. It lies all the time. That is, the stories that we tell ourselves about what happened are mere fabulations that are completely removed from what is actually happening. So when we think about consciousness as an interpretive agent, that is what interprets culture for us, we should also bear in mind that consciousness can be very badly mistaken about what is actually driving culture. And so I think we need to have a nuanced picture in which we benefit from consciousness, but we're also wary of its limitations, and especially when it comes to things like culture.
Hi, we would love to hear your comments and learn about what you see. Share your input at www.ccpodcast.com and follow us on social media. Oh, I almost forgot. To accompany us in this season's journey, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And now let's continue with Ceci.
In your book, Bacteria to AI, you also draw on Walter Benjamin's insight from the 1930s, where he talks about art and machines and how they were, at the time, moving along antagonistic paths. For him, art was grounded in tradition and history in the sense of how an aura gave each work its uniqueness. And you take that idea forward into the posthuman era, where it's no longer just the aura of art at stake, but the aura in general, as you've been telling us in this interview, of the individual human being. And as you point out, it's not simply a person confronting an apparatus anymore, increasingly, but the apparatus itself becoming the person. And it doesn't stop there, because it also reflects back to the human story with all its flaws and contradictions. And so all of these flaws are exposed at another scale for us to see and to confront. In my question, what transformations would enable the human aura to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem in today's era?
Yeah, so thank you for that. And just to fill in for our listeners, Walter Benjamin's argument is that the aura of an original artwork in the age of mechanical reproduction has been now threatened because you can produce infinite number of copies. Of course, he was writing before the possibilities of deep fakes, but now we know that it's not only artworks that can be reproduced and changed in all kinds of ways, but human behavior itself through deep fakes. Someone's voice, someone's posture can all be faked to make them say and do things that the actual person would never do. So the issue here is, if we are in an era of eroding the human aura, if the originality of the human person is being challenged by all of these new technologies, how can that serve a liberatory purpose, not merely be the loss of nostalgic past? So I think that real key here is to understand that the human is a social and cultural construction, and that we are jointly, collectively, as a global society, in the process of fashioning what the human means in the 21st century. And there are all kinds of daunting challenges that we've not yet even begun to work out. For example, if we continue to develop synthetic intelligences to the point where they develop the equivalent of consciousness, will they qualify for rights in some sense? And this is especially challenging as we're rethinking, in many ways, our conception of non-human rights. Do trees have standing, as the famous article goes? What kind of rights do non-humans have, and not just animals, but also plant life and other kinds of life? So these are huge challenges, and they really require deep ethical reflection in order to be able to come up with something that is humane, is kind, interactive, is respectful of other creatures with whom we share the earth, and at the same time flourishing for human communities as well. So those are immense challenges. In many cases, we've only taken the very first steps, if even that, in beginning to think through these different issues. So it's all up in the air, so to speak. And that's why I think it's important to emphasize the possibility of hope, because we collectively are going to do this together. And so we need to work together in order to come up with some viable solutions. It will be a collective decision, not an individual one, but each of us has our own small part to contribute to that.
Another problem feared in the introduction of AI is, of course, human labor, and particularly in terms of displacement of human roles, such as agency, identities, and self-worth. How do we design AI assemblies that enrich rather than suppress human self-worth values, ethics, and creativity?
Yeah, so I recently read an article that was arguing we should replace the term cyborg with cywork, which would combine work and cyborg. So it's true that in the area of labor, and of course Marx based his whole theory of capitalism on the assumption that human labor was primary, we're now seeing the displacement of human labor, even as we also see the denigration of human labor into things like crowdsourcing work or Turk crowdsourcing people that are paid, pennies for doing very small tasks. So the effect of AI on human labor is going to be massive, and it's going to displace a lot of present occupations. In my own field of literary studies, for example, reviews of books is something that an AI can do very well. I don't think we have fully come to terms, or we're only beginning to come to terms with what these dislocations of human labor mean.
Well, I think it would be very difficult to replace you and your brilliant thoughts and ideas, Professor Hayles. At least for me. And talking about all of these transformations, before I ask my next question, let's hear from Professor Richard Martin again. This time, he will be answering the question of whether myths die.
Very deep question, and I would like to say they don't die. I would like to say they're like Prometheus's liver. No matter how much you nibble away at it, it regenerates. I think if a culture dies, then the myths die. And the question for me would be whether, we invest in certain myths that are then going to kill off a culture. The myth of the salvation of humanity because of artificial intelligence is a really dangerous one. So let's hope that the culture doesn't die and take its myths with it. Otherwise, I'm pretty confident that myths will live.
Professor Hayles, what is the meaning of the post-human myth?
The post-human myth? Is there a post-human myth? What is the post-human myth?
Yeah, I would like to know if there's one, and if there is, what its meaning. What are we looking at?
Well, when I published my book, How We Became Posthuman, the title was conceived in an ironic mode, as if we had already become posthuman, which was intended as a provocation. But I'll start by saying that I consider human to be a cultural and historical conception. So there is very little that we can say about the human that is true of all members of our species at all times. A lot of it is culturally constructed about what we consider to be human, and that changes with cultures and changes with time. So the post-human myth, I suppose, takes various forms, but one of those forms is through transhumanism. And in that case, the post-human myth is about the overcoming of human mortality through technological means. So I have a lot of criticisms of transhumanism in the book, and I still have a lot of criticisms of transhumanism. But that's one form that the transhuman myth could take. Another form that the transhuman or the posthuman myth could take is that humanity changes so radically that it will really transform the nature of the species. And here I'm thinking of people like Ray Kurzweil, and so forth, that are talking about our descendants as creatures completely unlike us. So that's another form that the transhuman myth could take, or the posthuman myth could take. My own version of the posthuman future, if you will, is really articulated at the end of my new book, which is that a thorough revision of the Enlightenment ethos that we received to accommodate all these new developments in artificial intelligence, in understanding the cognitive capabilities of other species, and so forth. So I end my book on a very determined, optimistic note, because I think optimism is crucial. If we have to be able to imagine that we have a future in order to do what we need to do in the present to make that a reality. If we lose hope, I think we're doomed. And so I do try to end on an optimistic note and try to sketch out how the Enlightenment inheritance could be re-envisioned to make it suitable for the 21st century.
The hope that was kept in the jar of Pandora. At the beginning of our interview, I was referring to the books about trees I got interested in. And there's a wonderful book that drew me in from the very first page, which I later discovered as I was reading your book, Bacteria to AI, that was also referenced in, which is Richard Powers' The Overstory. And I have not yet finished it, but I have to say that until now, it has been an immersive experience. I love his subtle prose, how it weaves together the lives of trees and people, but how he does it gently, challenging these human-centered views that we've been talking about. He does it, I think, by showing how trees exist in their own timeless, poetic world, their umwelt, let's say, and what he does also is that he brings different umwelts sharing the planet. So are these the kinds of stories that we should be telling ourselves? And this part of this hope that will redirect human future ethics and ecological awareness, for example.
Yeah, that's a wonderful book. I'm so glad you mentioned it. I'm a real fan of Richard Powers' work, and The Overstory is one of his supreme accomplishments. So it really does center the human relationship with trees, as you mentioned, and you get a real feeling for trees as organisms, also for forests and all of the interconnections. So it's a book that I highly recommend. And if you will allow me, I'll make one more recommendation. This is not a novel, it's a work of nonfiction, but it's by the author Ed Yong, Y-O-N-G, called An Immense World. And what Yong does is to document dozens of species with very rich detail how they construct their worlds. So it's an expansion, if you will, of Uexküll's umwelt idea, also so richly documented and developed that it's really a delight to read.
And my last question, Professor. You were talking before about international regulation, and you also mentioned in your book Robinson's Ministry of the Future, right? Yes, Stanley Robinson's. Right. And I want to ask you if this utopian vision he has, should it serve as a model, do you think, or do you believe it is more an intent to warn us about the need, as you were saying, to rethink governance in the face of ecological crisis?
Yeah, I'm not sure the book is altogether an artistic success. It's very experimental. It experiments with all different kinds of narrators, including non-human ones, or on the cosmic scale or the microscopic scale. So I wouldn't say that it was a stunning novel the way that the overstory is, but what I really admire about the book is its determination to face these difficult challenges, especially the ecological ones, and to imagine a path forward. It does involve violence, about which I have mixed feelings, but nevertheless it is able to see a path forward for human beings past our present ecological crises into some livable future, which I think is admirable.
Professor Hale, this interview has been quite a ride and one of the most challenging for me intellectually speaking. I want to thank you for your clear thinking, but above all, for your rebellious mindset, which leads the way to embrace the future with caution, but also with a lot of excitement as well. Thank you for your precious time and for sharing so much knowledge, and with it helping us gain a better understanding of ourselves and the very nature of intelligence, or cognition, better said.
Well, thank you, Cecilia, so much for having me on. I very much enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you to all of our listeners, wherever you are, for having allowed us to share time with you. If you would like to find out more about Professor Hale's work, please visit her faculty page at Duke University and explore her fascinating writings, including her books My Mother Was a Computer, How We Became Posthuman, Unthought, and her most recent work, Bacteria to AI. We will provide a full list of her books and a link to her relevant articles in this episode's description. So be sure to check it out. See you next time. Bye-bye.